For many days, we couldn't believe that our former neighbors and friends were going to be the ones to kill us.
If I played with other children and I did something wrong or they were not happy with what I did, they would call me a dirty Jew.
We couldn't use our names. We had numbers, and I remember my number was 63. And when I see that number, sometimes if I'm in the grocery store, certain things trigger.
I cry why this has happened to us, and why us, and why anybody. How could a human being kill a human being? What for? What's the reason?
The Hessos are a Yazidi family of refugees from northern Iraq. They were sponsored to Canada following attacks on their ancient homeland. The Yazidis are an ethno-religious Kurdish minority who survived for thousands of years in northern Iraq. For the past 14 centuries, they've been targeted primarily because of their religion. In September of 2014, the Yazidis were attacked at Mount Sinjar by ISIS. The attack was so devastating, it prompted the United Nations Human Rights Council to identify such acts as genocide.
Raphael Limkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, coined the term to describe the systematic and massive killing of one group of people by another. Limkin successfully campaigned for international laws forbidding genocide. Limkin lost 49 relatives during the Nazi Holocaust, which occurred between 1933 and 1945. Over 6 million Jews were slaughtered. The United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This convention established genocide as an international crime which nations could prevent and punish. Dr. Adam Muller is an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. His areas of expertise include genocide and mass violence studies.
It's important to remember that genocide is more than just the law. It's also an experience. It's something that is undergone by people. So as an experience, genocide is an extremely varied and diverse phenomenon.
Genocide is distinguishable from other international crimes against humanity in that it requires specific intent. Perpetrators must have the intention of destroying a particular group in whole or in part. The victims must be a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group. In the case of the Yazidis of northern Iraq, their perceived crime is their religion. The Yazidis have suffered over 70 massacres. These acts of genocide reduced the Yazidi population from 23 million to just under 1 million survivors. During the Islamic State's attack on Mount Sinjar, thousands of Yazidis were slaughtered. Many Yazidis fled to the mountains, where they died from starvation or dehydration. Some Yazidis committed suicide to avoid being killed at the hands of ISIS. Yazidi women were brutally raped and made into sex slaves or murdered. Their children were abducted and brainwashed. Over 6,000 Yazidis remain in captivity.
Genocide has been described as a crime of crimes, Millions of individuals have lost their lives throughout history. Individuals have been exterminated because of their race, their ethnicity, or their religion.
The experience of genocide is very different for different people. Some people have an easier time getting over trauma than others. Some people get help getting over trauma. Other people don't, and this can affect, how they move through the legacy of atrocious events.
You don't want to be as a refugee anywhere in the world. When you become a refugee, it's like you lose your identity. You don't know if you're going to be back to your own country, to your home, to your friends and family members. It's not fun, definitely devastating. From the opportunities, from health, from education, from food, it's not the same. Every day go by, you're thinking about tomorrow. Are we gonna stay here in this little tent? Are we gonna be somewhere else? Are we gonna run away again? You just have that fears in you. You don't know who to believe and who to follow, and you're just trying to survive.
Edith Kilmaman survived genocide. Born into a well-to-do Jewish family in Poland right before the Nazi invasion, she recalls living a relatively normal life until Nazi soldiers shot and killed her father. Her mother was brutally beaten and would later die from her injuries. Edith and the other members of her family went into hiding, taking refuge in makeshift shelters and barns.
I knew that I was Jewish and I was not Christian and I was not Ukrainian because I was made to feel that by the other children. We were helpless to begin with and worthless because our house was ransacked by our neighbors while 2 days before we were owners and felt a pride of possession. 2 days later, we had nothing. The house was empty. It was very evident that things have changed completely and drastically.
Victims of the Holocaust spent years in displaced people's camp, waiting for governments around the world to welcome them as refugees. This wait took its toll on survivors. Days turned to months and then to years. Edith survived the Holocaust. In 1949, she became one of 40,000 Jewish refugees accepted into Canada. Edith feels indebted to Canada for giving her a second chance, an opportunity to live as a human being and not as a second-class citizen, marked by her beliefs.
I don't carry the experience because Canada has allowed me to live a life of freedom, but I always carry the fear. When you come from a displaced person camp, where there's always the fear, you suddenly come to a country and you're free to go to school, which I couldn't do. You're free to complain to someone. You know that the authority is going to listen to you, not as a Jew, but as a person. That freedom, my love for learning, those freedoms, I don't think my children even understand or appreciate because they grew up in a free country. I didn't. It has given me life and it has given my family life.
The Rwandan genocide in the mid-1990s led to the death of around 800,000 people. The Hutus slaughtered the Tutsis mercilessly. It remains one of the most tragic ethnic cleansing in history. Dr. Rajeen King was born and raised in Rwanda. She's a professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. Dr. King survived the 1994 Tutsi genocide. 2 of her brothers and many other family members did not.
I happened to belong to the Tutsi ethnic group, and my family and every other Tutsi in the country was targeted. Miraculously, I survived it, and I felt that God had the reason of my survival. So even to this point, I'm still searching for what that purpose. The first day they attacked our home, we managed to run away, but my uncle was killed on the spot.
When you flee the country, that means you lost everything. Now you became a citizenship to a different country. You started from zero.
I loved my parents with all my heart as an only child, and they were taken away. And throughout my life, I think I have feared total love, because not that I didn't want to give it, but I was afraid that those who I love would be taken away from me as my parents were, never to be returned.
To have 5 surviving, that's huge in Rwanda. Many families don't have any surviving member.
Many scholars have also identified other subtle but equally devastating forms of genocide. Although not included in the 1948 Genocide Convention, the United Nations definition of genocide includes forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. This act constitutes cultural genocide. Later attempts to add the phrase cultural genocide to the Genocide Convention failed. In terms of international law, an exact definition of cultural genocide remains unclear.
They call it cultural genocide, which is the destruction of cultural artifacts, which include books, structures, and artwork. It is also the suppression of cultural activities that the oppressor considers to be inappropriate.
Kevin Lamoureux is a lecturer at the University of Winnipeg. He has done extensive studies on cultural genocide with a focus on the Aboriginal community in Canada. Lamoureux has developed groundbreaking mentorship and inclusion programs in Aboriginal education. He is also a tireless advocate for the inclusion of Aboriginal perspectives in education.
So speaking specifically about residential schools, the purpose of the residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child. That's a term that's oftentimes credited to Duncan Campbell Scott, but it actually comes out of a much broader mindset that was political at that point in time. It was the Indian Act. It was a lot of the political discourse that was going on at the time that saw Indigenous peoples and treaty obligations as a burden to Canada, as being primitive and outdated, as being counter to what we envision Canada to be. And so there was a deliberate attempt to eliminate Indigenous people, at least culturally, from the landscape, legally and culturally. And that was the genesis for residential schools. That if we were to take First Nations kids away from their First Nations parents and educate them in a system that would teach them how to be more Canadian, that we would see an elimination of Indigenous identity.
Victoria McIntosh is a First Nation survivor of cultural genocide in Canada. She suffered extreme abuse and humiliation while enrolled in a residential school. At the age of 4, Victoria was separated from her siblings and her parents.
Oh boy, it was, I always felt not human anymore. There was no feelings, there was no such thing as, we couldn't say the word love. It was considered dirty. I remember the first day I was deloused. My hair was cut. They knew that our culture, our hair was so important. It's getting very emotional for me. When I talk to other survivors, it was the cutting of our hair and making us feel that shame.
The legacy of residential schools lives on. Survivors still grapple with the psychological effects of such institutions. Victoria suffers from low self-esteem and post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from her experience in a residential school.
The psychology of otherness and that journey of otherness, dehumanization, beginning first maybe with subtle jokes and innuendo, continuing on to the way that I raise my kids, continuing on into policy and to destructive social ideas. And we see that all over the world, don't we? Australia, for example, has the Stolen Generation, which is almost exactly the same residential school system imposed upon those kids. Throughout Africa, we see the wreckage of colonialism imposed upon people and the damages that are left behind, right? And one of the things, one of the symptoms of that wreckage, of that symptom in Canada is this: why don't they just get over it? That statement comes from a mindset of otherness. It's part of the wreckage of post-colonialism. We know that we would never talk to somebody we know, a family member or a friend who's been the victim of sexual abuse, and say to them, why don't you just get over that? It's not how we talk to one another. So why is it okay to say that to that other group of people?
Genocide has repeated itself throughout human history. It is a dirty stain on the consciousness of humanity. But the politics around the use of the term genocide has become a far greater preoccupation than the crisis itself.
Intervention before conflicts escalate is often weighed against the political and economic costs. Perhaps that is why every time the world says never again to genocide, it is about to ignite again somewhere.
There are so many implications in what causes genocide. They're political, they're economic to a degree. There is almost natural greed. There is a desire for power over others.
I think so long as we live in a world marked by finite resources and expanding populations with growing resource needs, and so long as there isn't enough of that stuff, you're going to find human beings contesting space with one another.
When we talk United States and British or Canada or Germany, powerful countries, they absolutely could have stopped that.
It's not in my backyard. Why do I care? And I think that's terrible for humanity.
I do not believe that we are ready not to repeat the mistakes of the past.
In cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
One of the most heartbreaking effects of the unspeakable horrors of genocide is the trauma inflicted upon victims. These conflicts force people to migrate, leaving behind homes and families and communities. These victims often languish in refugee camps, hoping to start a new life someday, somewhere. Victims assistance programs sponsored by individuals, religious organizations, and government agencies have rescued hundreds of survivors. These entities bring light to the darkness of genocide by evacuating the injured, protecting frightened children, and providing counseling to traumatized mothers. Here in Canada, a group known as Winnipeg Friends of Israel is a grassroots organization that initiated Operation Isra to help bring Yazidi refugees to Canada. This group builds bridges with other communities because of the belief that collaboration is one of the most effective ways to prevent genocide.
Genocide can destroy a group of people, not just people, but whole groups. Many of them wait for years in refugee camps, and it's really not a way to live. Some refugee camps are situated in war zones, which put the refugees at risk for the second time, even though they're in refugee camps. And many refugees just can't go back to the place where they were persecuted and their families were killed. We started this program with a few other organizations, Bridges for Peace, Calvary Temple, as well as the Mennonite Central Committee. Together, we raised about $120,000. Fundraising drive was transferred to the Jewish community here in Winnipeg, and it grew from there.
I saw the video of the pilot being burnt, the Jordanian pilot. I saw him in a cage, the same way you've seen it, the whole world has seen it. I said to myself, what could I do? A few days later or a week later, we saw the same cage, but full of children dressed in orange jumpsuits. It hit me to the core. It didn't sit right with me, and I decided to contact some of the people that I had touched base with during the time of me trying to do business in Iraq. And they loved the idea of helping these innocents in any form or way that we could. Obviously, it took money. I was willing to put money, my own money there, and that's what I did. And we did a lot in the beginning before CYCI existed and was founded.
The atrocities that I lived through were unfair to me as a child. Being deprived of my parents' love at such an early age and witnessing their death unnecessarily, for that I feel resentment. I feel resentment that I could not stay where I was. I don't know what I would have been. I don't know if I would have had siblings or not. My father was killed, he was 31 years old. So those things will always stay with me. I can't forget them.
The fight against genocide is not only a moral issue, but also a human rights issue as well. The indignity of any individual or group is an affront to peace and equality around the world.
There's no excuse. We cannot look at the other way and remain spectators.
Talking to, here in Canada, to our MPs, write letters, raise awareness to the plight of the group that you want to help, and raise money for the purpose of sponsoring people and getting them out of war zone.
New generations of Canadians who learn about our history, that learn about cultural genocide, without needing to internalize a sense of shame or a sense of guilt, but to see themselves as agents of change, as contributing to a better future.
In 10, 20, 30 years, we will look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what did we do when we could have acted? We did nothing.
This is what you did to me at 6 years old. You did this to me.
People can change overnight. And these were the same people. We were not moved to a different community.
We were like friends before. When that happened, everybody turned their back to us. Everybody pointed their gun to us.
In the midst of that craziness, there were few people who were ready to give up their lives, but offered to protect us.
If human lives matter to you, you must take a stand against genocide. The world should not stand by and allow it to happen again.